Hey, welcome everybody. I'm Matt Billingsley, Housing Law Unit Head with South Carolina Legal Services. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this little quick presentation with evictions from rent-to-own situations. All right, and so going on, do you live in a rent-to-own situation? That's generally where you are paying an amount down. Sometimes they call it owner financing. Sometimes there can be an option to purchase. Other times there could be something where you're just paying over time and then the property is turned over to you. So if you might be in one of those situations, let's talk about it. Things generally that a tenant in general should know. This is just real quick. If you're in a rent to own, there are different types of it. You just need to be aware. But whether it's rent or whether it's paying on a rent to own or paying towards on an installment sale for the land, what you need to do is document how you get paid. Here's a mentioning about cash. If you're paying in cash, get a receipt. Make sure you have some kind of documentation of it. Extremely important. You pay by check, money order. However, if you're sending someone from an online payment platform, in these situations, especially rent to own, you really need to document your payments. They oftentimes will end up in some kind of court activity, and that's a really valuable tool to be able to show how much you've actually paid. It's really important, so just make sure you document that. All right, now in general for landlords or landlord's responsibilities, they generally have to provide things like essential services, heat, electricity, those kind of things. They have certain times they can come on the property, come and do maintenance and all that. When you're in a rent to own, one thing to keep in mind is a lot of rent to owns are not really landlord tenant. And because of that, you may not have these same responsibilities. And look for that in the agreement. The agreement saying that you have to provide the essential services or do repairs on essential services or do all of your own repairs. Those are going to be clues that it's really not a landlord-tenant scenario. Usually you're going to see a landlord-tenant that's a true rent-to-own where you have a lease, and separate from that lease, you have an option to purchase. You pay a little bit of money for, and that option just kind of sits there with those terms. But that still keeps the person as the landlord, meaning the landlord or the person giving you the option to purchase still has to do repairs and those kind of things. A lot of times they're really selling the property and calling it a rent to own. So just be aware of that. It's all about the substance of it, not what's necessarily written on the paper. Things you should know, your responsibilities, of course, these are just general tenant responsibilities. Keep in mind, again, if you're in a rent to own, it may not exactly be a landlord tenant situation. So that whole can't make repairs and deduct the cost. What that would go into if it's an installment contract or a rent to own situation that's not really landlord tenant, then what you would need to do is pay your payments, and you can't really stop those payments. It's almost like paying on a loan or something like that. You'd have to keep making those payments and doing the repairs and things like that are further evidence that you are actually buying the property as opposed to being a tenant. But if you are a tenant and you do have an option separate, you still can't do certain things and have to abide by the landlord tenant laws of South Carolina in that regard. So be aware of that. Okay, the normal eviction process goes when somebody doesn't pay rent or the lease ends or a lease has been violated. Of course, we're talking about rent to own, and that's probably not going to be the normal situation. The normal eviction process, when you see that term used in these, tenant getting a 5-day notice to pay the rent, or 5-day grace period, that's usually in the lease itself. Of course, it might be a little different here with a rent to own. So just keep in mind, this is kind of the normal residential landlord tenant information. The eviction papers are a rule to vacate. Plenty of times someone who's in a rent to own or purchasing from a seller, sometimes owner financing or something like that, they still might get served a rule to vacate because the other person is trying to make you move the same way they do a tenant, even if it's not a tenant. So you still have to be aware. You have 10 days to respond if you get a rule to vacate served on you. Make sure you do that. If you don't respond, a writ of ejectment gets issued. You don't want to go down that road. You want to address it in the court. Okay? The rent to own overview. Home sales start with a rental that can become a sale. The seller promises the deed if you've paid a certain number of payments. These contracts, really what they are is generally called installment land sale contracts when they're set up like that. You pay an amount down, like a down payment, and then you pay a certain amount of payments and a certain amount of money, and then you've exercised your option and you own it after you pay those payments. Really what it is, like an owner finance sale, not so much of an actual rental. The important thing to know is that they usually have what they call a forfeiture clause in there, which is why they say, well, the seller could cancel the contract if the buyer doesn't make all the payments or breaches the contract. So make sure you review the contract before signing it. Make sure you really look at it, read it, and try to understand what it's actually saying. How much should you pay? When's the payment due? How many payments will get the deed to the property? Those are things that are important to know, important to be aware of, or what's in the contract that you're agreeing to. Okay. Magistrate courts are not supposed to hear rent-to-own evictions. What their jurisdiction does not involve rent to own or does not involve a sale. It involves only landlord tenant. When it involves a sale, that's when you take it out of landlord tenant. So you have to present that to the magistrate. Make sure you argue that, present your evidence there on why it's a sale. Look at the substance of what you've signed. Okay, if you have a separate lease and a separate option to purchase at a certain price that you can notify them at some point, maybe when you obtain financing or something, that's more of a true rent to own. If it's contained in the contract, you pay X amount of payments, the lease is for 8 years, and 8 years of payments, all of a sudden you own it, that's really a sales contract. So be aware of that, present that information, to the magistrate. It would have to go to a different court. You would have to ask that the magistrate court dismiss the case, or in some cases refer the case or transfer the case to the court of common pleas. Okay, that's where you see your circuit court. That's the court of common pleas. Circuit court is that next level up, and that they would have the jurisdiction to decide who owns the home or what the rights are of everyone. It involves other things like sometimes what they call a right of redemption. So there's just more to determine and figure out. Parties can also, in circuit court, request discovery. That means asking for information and documents from each other, ask them to answer certain questions while the case is going on. Landlords who are companies, keep in mind, in circuit court, they do have to represent themselves. They are required to have an attorney. So sometimes they're an individual, they're setting up that way, and they're doing this contract with you, but once they get to court of common pleas and circuit court, they will have to get an attorney. Okay? That's it for now. It's just something to be aware of. Know what your contract is, raise those issues, know that you're in the right spot, or things to pay attention to, or to keep an eye on. Don't stop those payments if you can help it. But here's information about a little more information about us, how you can apply for our free services, some of our social media information and newsletter information right there. All right, hope you enjoyed this session. Look at some of our other ones. We got plenty of great ones on the way.